The disappearance of MH370 remains one of the most haunting mysteries of the modern era. A commercial aircraft carrying hundreds of people vanished without a distress signal, without a confirmed location, and without a final answer. But what troubles many people is not only where the plane went, but why the story around it was closed so quickly. While the world is covered by military radar, surveillance satellites, and global tracking systems operating day and night, the investigation into MH370 still reveals too many gaps that are hard to explain. These contradictions drew the attention of Ashton Forbes, a citizen investigator who has spent years following this case. He did not begin with shocking theories, but with a simple and uncomfortable question. If the data still exists, why have we still not been able to determine the true location of MH370? And the arguments raised by Ashton Forbes may force any of us to re-examine what we thought we knew about what really happened to MH370. Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 disappeared on March 8, 2014 during what was supposed to be a routine overnight flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, carrying 239 passengers and crew who expected to arrive just a few hours later. Less than an hour after takeoff, the aircraft stopped communicating with air traffic control, and despite the seriousness of this silence, no distress call was sent, no emergency signal was triggered, and no immediate explanation followed. From the perspective of civilian radar systems, the plane simply vanished, creating a situation that felt both sudden and deeply unsettling, even by aviation standards. In the first hours after contact was lost, authorities informed the public that MH370 was believed to have disappeared over the South China Sea, a statement that quickly shaped the direction of the search and the expectations of families around the world. Ships and aircraft were deployed toward that region, while relatives followed official briefings closely, trusting that investigators were working with a complete and accurate picture of what had happened. At that stage, the disappearance was framed as tragic but familiar, a rare aviation accident that would likely be explained once debris or flight data was recovered. That sense of confidence did not last. Several days later, new information quietly altered the foundation of the entire investigation when military radar data revealed that MH370 had not continued along its planned route, but had instead turned back, crossed the Malaysian peninsula, and flown west toward the Strait of Malacca. This was not a minor update, because it meant the aircraft had remained airborne for far longer than initially believed, and that the original search area had been based on incomplete information. The most critical hours of the operation had already passed, and with them, the opportunity to search in the right place at the right time. For many observers, this raised concerns about communication and coordination, but for Ashton Forbes, it marked the moment when the official narrative began to lose its credibility. As a citizen investigator with no ties to government agencies or major media organizations, Ashton approached the case without the need to protect institutions or defend early decisions. What drew him into the MH370 mystery was not speculation about sabotage or dramatic endings, but the realization that the story at the very beginning had shifted without clear explanation. He focused on the timeline, noticing how confidently the initial information had been presented and how quietly it was later revised once the radar turnback became impossible to ignore. In aviation investigations, early decisions carry enormous weight because search areas, resources, and public understanding are all shaped within the first hours after an aircraft disappears. When those decisions are based on partial data, the consequences are rarely temporary, since lost time cannot be recovered and evidence does not remain in place. Families of the passengers felt the impact of this delay almost immediately, as many began to question why such a crucial detail had not been shared from the start. The frustration did not come from impatience, but from the growing sense that transparency had been sacrificed during the most important phase of the investigation. Ashton paid close attention to these reactions because they reflected a deeper issue than emotional distress. They pointed to a widening gap between what modern technology was capable of detecting and what the public was being told. Rather than accusing authorities of intentional wrongdoing, Ashton treated this gap as a signal that the investigation itself deserved closer scrutiny. He noted how quickly the revised radar information faded from public discussion, even though it fundamentally changed the understanding of MH370's final path. The narrative moved forward, but the consequences of the initial misdirection were never fully examined or openly addressed. For Ashton, this was the moment when MH370 stopped being only a story about a missing aircraft and became a case study in how decisions are made under pressure. Once trust begins to erode in the opening hours of an investigation, every explanation that follows carries an added layer of doubt. This realization pushed him to look beyond the first official statements and toward the broader environment in which MH370 disappeared. The early radar revelation did not bring the case closer to closure. Instead, it expanded the scope of what needed to be questioned, setting the stage for a deeper examination of the skies MH370 had crossed. As the search for MH370 moved beyond the first chaotic days, attention slowly shifted from where the aircraft might have ended up to a more unsettling realization about the airspace it had crossed. Modern skies are not open and unmonitored, especially in regions that sit near busy shipping lanes, military installations, and international flight corridors where multiple tracking systems operate at the same time. Commercial aviation relies on civilian radar, but that is only one layer of a much larger surveillance environment that includes military sensors, early warning systems, and space-based observation. Ashton Forbes began examining this broader picture and noticed a growing disconnect between what technology is designed to do and what information was actually made public. From his perspective, the idea that a wide-body aircraft could fly for hours through monitored airspace without being noticed by any system seemed increasingly difficult to accept. He did not argue that every radar or satellite should have a complete picture of the flight, but he pointed out that overlapping coverage usually creates partial records that can be combined. In regions like Southeast Asia, airspace is closely watched for reasons that go far beyond civilian travel, including national security, border protection, and regional military readiness. This reality led Ashton to focus less on a single missing signal and more on the absence of shared data from multiple sources. He observed that when information from one system disappears, other systems often provide confirmation, correction, or context that helps investigators fill the gaps. In the MH370 case, that cross-confirmation never appeared in public view. Instead, the narrative leaned heavily on limited civilian tracking while leaving the role of military and strategic monitoring largely unexplored. Ashton treated this silence carefully, recognizing that classified systems do not release raw data easily and that secrecy does not automatically imply wrongdoing. However, he also noted that investigations depend on transparency, especially when public trust has already been shaken by early missteps. What stood out was not the absence of a single data source, but the absence of any meaningful discussion about how many systems might have observed the flight indirectly. Air defense networks are designed to detect movement patterns rather than identify individual aircraft, which means they often capture trajectories even when identities are unclear. Satellites that monitor heat, motion, and communication signals also record far more than what is later shared with the public. Ashton did not claim to know what these systems recorded. His concern was that their existence was barely acknowledged as part of the investigation. For families and observers, This created a sense that the sky MH370 traveled through was being described as emptier than it truly was. The investigation appeared to narrow rather than expand, focusing on what could be proven with limited data instead of what might be clarified with broader cooperation. This narrowing effect had consequences because it shaped public expectations about what answers were even possible. As time passed, the absence of discussion around surveillance capabilities became normalized, and the lack of shared data was treated as an unavoidable limitation rather than a choice. Ashton saw this as a structural issue rather than a personal failure, rooted in how information flows between civilian authorities and defense institutions. When those channels remain closed, even unintentionally, investigations lose context that could challenge early assumptions. The sky itself became part of the mystery, not because it hid the plane, but because it concealed how much was known and how much was withheld. This realization pushed the MH370 story into a different phase, where the focus was no longer just on disappearance, but on visibility. The question of tracking was no longer about whether the plane existed in the air, but about how many systems were watching and how little of that watching reached the public record. As the investigation continued, this imbalance between capability and disclosure set the stage for deeper reliance on indirect data sources. It was within this constrained environment that one particular system would later become the backbone of the official explanation. As attention shifted away from radar coverage and visible tracking systems, the investigation into MH370 began to rely heavily on a source of data that was never designed to locate aircraft. That source was Inmarsat, a satellite communication network created to maintain contact with planes flying over remote regions, not to trace their exact position in the sky. In simple terms, Inmarsat did not record where MH370 was, but only that the aircraft was still capable of sending automated signals back to the satellite network. These brief digital handshakes confirmed that the plane remained powered for several hours after it disappeared from radar, but they offered no direct coordinates and no visual confirmation. Investigators used this limited information to construct a model, translating timing and signal behavior into large arcs across the globe that later became known as the seventh arc. This model quickly became the backbone of the official narrative, shaping search zones and reinforcing the belief that MH370 ended its flight in the southern Indian Ocean. Ashton Forbes approached this shift with caution because he recognized that the model depended not only on data, but on assumptions layered on top of that data. The calculations required estimates about the aircraft's speed, altitude, and direction, as well as assumptions about how the flight was being controlled during its final hours. None of these assumptions were confirmed by direct evidence, yet they were treated as stable foundations for narrowing the search. Ashton did not dismiss the Inmarsat data itself, because he acknowledged that it was one of the few continuous records available after radar contact was lost. What concerned him was how quickly interpretation was elevated to certainty. When a model becomes the center of an investigation, its limits often fade from public discussion, even though small changes in assumptions can lead to vastly different outcomes. In the case of MH370, the reliance on Inmarsat gradually shifted attention away from unanswered questions about surveillance coverage and toward a single, narrow conclusion. This narrowing effect created the appearance of resolution without the substance of proof. The public was told that the math pointed south, even though the math could not explain intent, control, or precise location. Ashton viewed this as a fragile foundation, not because the calculations were careless, but because they were asked to carry more weight than they were designed to support. In aviation history, models are meant to guide investigation, not replace evidence. Here, the absence of physical confirmation allowed probability to harden into belief. As years passed, the seventh arc became less a hypothesis and more a boundary that few were willing to question openly. This shift had lasting consequences because once the search was framed around a single outcome, alternative interpretations were increasingly treated as distractions. Ashton noted that this dynamic did not resolve uncertainty, but managed it by reducing the range of acceptable discussion. The investigation appeared to move forward, yet the underlying uncertainty remained untouched. By the time debris began to surface far from the projected crash zone, the narrative had already been set. The Inmarsat model had defined the story, even though the story still lacked its most critical element, a complete and verifiable end to the flight. As reliance on abstract data grew stronger, the need for physical confirmation became even more pressing, setting the stage for the next phase of the MH370 investigation. One of the strongest reasons many people believe the MH370 case is already solved is the discovery of aircraft debris along the shores of the Indian Ocean. Over the years, multiple pieces were recovered on beaches in places like Réunion Island, Mozambique, and Madagascar, and several of them were later identified as parts consistent with a Boeing 777. These findings mattered because they offered something the investigation had lacked from the beginning, which was physical evidence that could be touched, tested, and measured. However, physical evidence does not automatically equal a complete answer, and this is where the story becomes more complicated than it first appears. Most of the confirmed debris consists of small structural components, such as flaperons, panels, or fragments that could detach during a breakup, but none of them include the main fuselage, cockpit, engines, or black boxes. In aviation investigations, these missing elements are not minor details because they usually provide the clearest information about what happened in the final moments of a flight. Without them, investigators are forced to rely on indirect interpretation rather than direct confirmation. Supporters of the official search area argue that ocean currents can scatter debris across thousands of miles, which explains why parts appeared far from the supposed crash zone. That argument is not unreasonable, but it depends heavily on drift models that are built on assumptions about currents, wind patterns, and the timing of when debris entered the water. Different scientific teams using different inputs have produced different drift paths, and some of those paths do not clearly point back to the same origin. This is where critics like Ashton Forbes raise a careful but important point about limits rather than accusations. The debris proves that the aircraft broke apart at some stage, but it does not precisely prove where that breakup occurred or how the aircraft reached that location. When debris is found years later without a clear chain of custody from crash site to shoreline, it loses some of its ability to lock the timeline into place. Another issue is the absence of acoustic detections that would normally be expected from a large aircraft impacting the ocean at high speed. Underwater listening systems have detected much smaller events in the past, yet no confirmed acoustic signature has been publicly linked to MH370. This silence does not mean a crash did not happen, but it does mean that the physical picture remains incomplete. Ashton does not claim that the debris is fake or planted, but he argues that it is being asked to carry more explanatory weight than it realistically can. In his view, the fragments answer one narrow question about structural failure while leaving many larger questions untouched. This gap between what the debris shows and what people want it to prove keeps the case open rather than closed. Because the physical evidence cannot fully anchor the timeline or location, researchers have begun looking beyond traditional aviation data for additional clues that might fill those gaps. As the MH370 investigation reached the limits of traditional aviation evidence, some researchers began exploring data sources that were never meant to track aircraft. One of the most unexpected tools to enter the discussion was Weak Signal Propagation Reporter, a global radio network used by amateur operators to study how weak signals travel across long distances. WSPR does not follow planes, record coordinates, or monitor flight behavior, which makes its data structurally independent from aviation systems. This independence is exactly what caught the attention of analysts searching for signals unaffected by radar gaps or satellite assumptions. The principle behind the analysis is straightforward, even though the execution requires careful interpretation. A large metal object moving at high speed can disturb radio signal paths, slightly altering signal strength and timing between transmitters and receivers. These disturbances are subtle and easy to miss, but when viewed across many signal paths, patterns can begin to emerge. When researchers examined WSPR logs from the night MH370 disappeared, they identified clusters of anomalies occurring within the same time window. Individually, none of these irregularities would be meaningful, but together they suggested that something large passed through multiple signal corridors. What makes this notable is that these corridors were not defined by flight plans or search models, but by the existing geometry of radio transmitters around the world. Unlike radar or satellite reconstructions, WSPR data does not assume pilot intent or aircraft behavior. It simply records how signals behaved at a given moment in time. This reduces the risk of shaping data to fit a preferred narrative while increasing the importance of cross-checking results. Critics correctly point out that radio signals are influenced by weather, solar activity, and background interference. Because of this, WSPR cannot produce a precise track or a confirmed location. Its value lies in narrowing possibilities rather than delivering conclusions. In the MH370 case, some interpretations of the WSPR disturbances appear more consistent with paths west of the widely accepted search zone. This does not overturn earlier findings, but it challenges the assumption that the original focus area was beyond question. Ashton Forbes emphasizes that WSPR should not be treated as proof, but as an independent signal that deserves serious attention. For him, the importance of this data is not where it points, but what it reveals about how much uncertainty still exists. As independent sources begin to overlap without relying on the same assumptions, the investigation moves from defending past answers to reassessing where the search truly belongs. More than a decade after MH370 vanished, the case continues to resurface because it was never truly resolved, only set aside. Official reports brought the search to an end, but they did not bring closure, and that distinction matters more with time. In aviation history, most disasters eventually settle into a clear sequence of events supported by wreckage, data, and consensus. MH370 never reached that point, leaving behind a conclusion that many accepted out of exhaustion rather than certainty. What keeps the case alive is not a single new theory, but the accumulation of unresolved gaps that refuse to disappear. Each new dataset, whether satellite-based, radio-based, or observational, adds pressure to revisit assumptions that once seemed fixed. The return of private search efforts reflects this tension between official finality and ongoing doubt. Companies do not invest millions of dollars in deep-sea searches unless they believe there is a realistic chance of finding something meaningful. Their involvement signals that uncertainty still exists at a professional level, not just among online communities. Ashton Forbes views this renewed interest as evidence that the story of MH370 is incomplete rather than concluded. He does not claim to know what happened in the final moments of the flight, but he argues that unanswered questions deserve continued scrutiny. The persistence of the case also reveals a broader issue about how modern investigations handle uncertainty. When evidence is indirect and fragmented, narratives can solidify before proof arrives. Once that happens, reopening discussion becomes increasingly difficult, even when new information challenges old boundaries. MH370 exposes the limits of confidence built on models rather than confirmation. It shows how easily probability can replace proof when physical evidence remains out of reach. This dynamic has consequences beyond one missing aircraft. It shapes how future investigations balance transparency, credibility, and public trust. For families of the passengers, the lack of resolution is not an abstract problem, but an ongoing absence. For the aviation world, it represents a case study in how unanswered questions can linger beneath official statements. As time moves forward, MH370 shifts from being a historical event to an active reminder of what happens when closure arrives without certainty. That unresolved state is what keeps researchers, analysts, and search teams returning to the same question from different angles. The story continues not because the past refuses to rest, but because the present still demands clarity. This ongoing pressure would eventually extend beyond investigation and into policy, forcing the aviation industry to confront the weaknesses exposed by MH370. Although MH370 was never fully explained, its disappearance quietly reshaped how the global aviation industry thinks about tracking, transparency, and responsibility. Before MH370, long-haul flights over oceans often relied on periodic position reports and ground-based radar coverage that faded once aircraft moved beyond continental airspace. These gaps were known inside the industry, but they were rarely discussed outside professional circles and almost never questioned by the public. MH370 exposed how large those blind spots truly were. In response, international aviation authorities began to reassess the assumption that losing contact for hours was an acceptable risk in modern flight operations. The International Civil Aviation Organization introduced new global standards requiring aircraft to report their position at least every 15 minutes during normal operations. In abnormal or emergency situations, that reporting interval was reduced to as little as 1 minute. This shift marked a fundamental change in how flight continuity was defined, moving from optional reporting to continuous awareness. Satellite-based tracking systems were expanded to reduce reliance on ground radar, especially over oceans, deserts, and remote regions. Many commercial aircraft today are connected to global satellite networks that provide near real-time location updates regardless of geography. Airlines also began reconsidering how flight data is stored and transmitted. Instead of relying solely on physical recorders that must be recovered after a crash, some operators now explore real-time data streaming to secure ground servers. The goal is not constant surveillance, but the prevention of total information loss when an aircraft experiences a critical failure. MH370 also highlighted weaknesses in how civil and military data are shared during emergencies. Investigators recognize that delays and silos in the first hours of a crisis can permanently shape outcomes. As a result, coordination protocols were reviewed to improve the speed and clarity of information exchange when an aircraft disappears under unclear circumstances. These policy changes did not solve the mystery of MH370, but they ensured that a similar disappearance would be far more difficult to repeat unnoticed. The aircraft itself was never found, yet its absence forced the industry to confront uncomfortable truths about visibility and accountability. MH370 became a turning point, not because it delivered answers, but because it revealed how fragile certainty can be without continuous data. The legacy of the flight now lives in systems designed to prevent silence from ever becoming the final chapter again. MH370 was never simply a missing aircraft, but a test of how modern systems respond when certainty collapses. Years later, the case still matters because it exposed gaps between technology, transparency, and trust. Independent investigators like Ashton Forbes did not replace official inquiries, but they challenged the comfort of incomplete answers. The story of MH370 continues not as a rumor, but as a reminder. When data exists but clarity does not, silence is never a conclusion.